I am pleased now to give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Children in Armed Conflict. We welcome today's open debate convened by Brazil and thank the briefers for their statements. We would like to acknowledge and thank Patrick Kumi, in particular, for sharing his experience and recommendations. We encourage the Security Council to regularly include children and youth briefers in its deliberations and briefings, and call for the safe and meaningful inclusion and participation of children and youth in all matters of peace and security, including political and peace processes, protection and humanitarian responses, and reintegration programming, among others. The Group of Friends is deeply concerned by the figures and trends presented in the Secretary General's annual report. Reading this report, together with recent analysis conducted by UNICEF, which highlights that grave violations have increased year over year for the past 16 years, we are presented with a dire picture of the plight facing conflict-affected children. Persistently high levels of killing and maiming of children, recruitment and use of children, and the denial of humanitarian assistance by parties to armed conflict are extremely troubling. The dramatic increase in abductions is cause for serious concern, as abduction often leads to other grave violations against children. Significant increases in verified incidents of sexual violence against children are also alarming and must be reversed. This grave violation disproportionately affects girls while also impacting boys and is already prone to severe underreporting and a lack of data. We are dismayed by the widespread attacks against schools and hospitals as presented in the report, particularly amidst the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which is causing the largest disruption to children's education in history. Furthermore, we are alarmed by the soaring numbers of children displaced as a result of conflict and violence around the world. Now more than 36.5 million children, according to the UN. This figure does not include the more than 4.5 million children who have been displaced by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Displaced children face heightened risks, including vulnerability to trafficking, forced deportation, exploitation, recruitment and use, and other abuses, particularly for children with disabilities and those who are unaccompanied or separated from their caregivers. Against this troubling backdrop, the Group of Friends would like to make the following recommendations, which we commit ourselves to follow up on through our own collective engagement. First, we urge all parties to armed conflict to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law, and to act to prevent and end grave violations against children. To this end, we strongly encourage all parties to armed conflict to sign and implement action plans and other concrete and time-bound measures to enhance the protection of children in armed conflict. Second, we call for full accountability for grave violations through national and international justice mechanisms, such as the International Criminal Court. True justice also involves reparations and access to gender and age-sensitive comprehensive specialized services, including medical, mental health and psychosocial support, and sexual and reproductive health care services, as well as legal and livelihood support to survivors of grave violations. Third, a growing number of member states have acceded to or endorsed key instruments aimed at strengthening the protection of children in armed conflict. We encourage all UN member states to accede to the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and to consider endorsing and implementing practical child protection instruments such as the Safe Schools Declaration, the Paris Principles and Commitments, and the Vancouver Principles on Peacekeeping and the Prevention of the Recruitment and Use of Child Soldiers. Fourth, we call for adequate resourcing for child protection specialists and activities, including within UN peace operations, UN country task forces on monitoring and reporting, and in international fact-finding and investigative mechanisms, as well as international judicial bodies. Fifth and finally, we urge the Security Council, member states, the UN Secretariat, and host countries to support the full implementation of child protection mandates by UN peace operations, including in context where the UN may be transitioning. We also recall the importance of the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund, which can play key roles in mobilizing attention and resources to address the needs of children in conflict and post-conflict settings, including for the reintegration of children formerly associated with armed forces and armed groups. Monsieur le Président.
President, upon the 25th anniversary of the Mandate of Children and Armed Conflict, we express our sincere gratitude for the work of the Special Representative of the Secretary General, UNICEF, and all those involved in the protection of children within the United Nations and civil society. Over the last 25 years, we have worked together to implement a suite of robust tools supporting this unique and important mandate, from the monitoring and reporting mechanism to the Security Council Working Group, amongst many others. These tools must be defended and bolstered. In this regard, the Group of Friends reaffirms the importance we attach to the independence, impartiality and credibility of the monitoring and reporting mechanism and the mechanism for establishing lists as they figure in the annual reports of the Secretary-General on Children and Armed Conflict. These two tools together remain particularly important in our efforts to protect children and foster accountability for serious violations. We note that Ethiopia, Mozambique, Ukraine and the Central Sahel region have been included in the report as situations of concern with immediate effect. We also underline the decisions about the inclusion on the lists figuring in the annexes and criteria underpinning these decisions. We reaffirm our long-standing call for the information presented in the Secretary-General's annual reports, as gathered and verified by the monitoring and reporting mechanism, to be reflected in the annexes to the report in a precise and timely manner. We also recall the importance for the Secretary-General to use clear criteria and procedures for the listing and delisting of parties to a conflict deemed responsible for serious violations in all situations included within the report. President, allow me to make a brief statement as representative of Canada. Currently, over 40 million children are displaced in the world because of conflicts and violence. This figure is greater than the total population of my country, Canada, and that of over 157 member states of the United Nations. Any displacement of a child due to war is one displacement too many. The displacement of over 40 million children is a catastrophe, and this is of human origin. This topic is the subject of debate within the Council, but these violations are taking place in states where governments and other protagonists have obligations. In Afghanistan, the Taliban are shamelessly quashing the rights of girls, particularly their right to education. Last year, more Afghan boys were killed and maimed than in any other country of the world. In the Central Sahel region and the Lake Chad Basin, we are noting the steeper increase in serious violations against girls. In Syria, the Assad regime is continuing its attacks against children, bombarding schools and hospitals, recruiting children into their armed forces. We are concerned regarding the decision to move the Syrian government within the annex of the report of the Secretary-General. This decision should only have been taken based on a significant decrease in serious violations and respect for specific commitments accompanied by deadlines. According to the very report of the Secretary-General, the Syrian government has achieved neither of these things. This is therefore a troubling precedent. In Ukraine, children have been killed and maimed by Russian forces. It can be proved that deliberate, large-scale attacks have been committed in schools and hospitals. Russia has arrested and forcibly expelled hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children. Rape and sexual violence against Ukrainian girls and boys are very widespread. These affirmations are not merely assertions by Canada, but facts corroborated by the UN, the OSCE, and independent organizations.
Ukraine, as a situation of concern in the Secretary-General's report, is a welcome step, as is the inclusion of Ethiopia and Mozambique in the same manner. We applaud the Secretary-General's initiative. In these three situations and all others, we urge the Secretary-General to ensure that the verification of information on grave violations against children leads to accurate, credible, and transparent listing decisions. This is critical to changing behavior and holding parties to conflict accountable. Allow me to make 3 points to conclude. First, we hear the calls for more resources for child protection. There is no substitute for dedicated expertise, and we know that the demands on the system are greater than ever before. Canada is committed to advocating for these resources to ensure that the UN has what it needs to do this important work. Second, it is encouraging to see the growing number of countries endorse key instruments to protect children. Third and finally, for years, Canada and many other member states have requested the Secretary General to release this report earlier in advance of the annual debate at the Council. This is an important report with significant decisions that can impact both bilateral and multilateral policies. All member states, regardless of their status, should have more time to consider and review its contents. Thank you, Mr. President. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Canada. And now